If you were in a jail cell and somebody gave you the keys to get out, would you just sit there or would you try to do something about it? Well, Pastor Ray says maybe we do that spiritually right now, and we'll talk about that on this episode of Sermon Shorts. Welcome to Sermon Shorts, Pastor Ray Sunday. You talked about God's people, God's places, God's plans. You used an oft-quoted passage in Jeremiah that led to us talking about the people of Israel.
Right.
They were in captivity for 70 years. God freed them, and yet not everyone took advantage of that. Let's take a look at what you had to say about that.
Well, let me give you something that's interesting and tragic about this story. That is that when God did free them, 70 years later, fast forward, this is the front side, right? When He did free them, 70 years later, when He freed them. Do you know that many of those who now were free to return to Israel refused to go back to Israel? Only a remnant went back. Many of the people that could return decided not to return. They stayed in Babylon. You know what they had done? They had adjusted their lives to the paganism of their culture.
Pastor, that was Israel. That was God's people then, but we're all God's people now.
Right.
And we may not be taken by a foreign power for 70 years, literally, but we can also choose to stay in Babylon. How? How does that look in our lives?
Well, I would say this as part of the analogy is that we can still be taken captive by our culture. Israel had a great deal of freedom in Babylon. That's one of the interesting sides that we didn't talk about, is that they had a lot of freedom. They had a lot of freedom for themselves and for their families. It wasn't like they were locked behind prison walls. And so they had freedoms there, but they were still captives. And you fast forward that today, and many Christians aren't locked behind walls. In some places in the world they are, but let's take our context. We're not locked behind prison walls. We have a great deal of freedom of faith, you could say. And yet we often live our lives in captive to man and to the world. And so in that sense, we become a lot like those Israelites who had been freed from the captivity of man to return to the place that God had designed for them, and they chose to stay put. And I think in our own lives, and I think probably for many of them, it wasn't like a malicious rejection of the freedom God had given to them. It was just they had become content. And so they had mixed their belief system with the belief systems of paganism. And so, but they were okay with that. They were okay to raise their kids that way, and consequently, they didn't even think about its effect on them and on their walk with God. And I think we are there sometimes when we refuse to go on with God. God calls us, as you know, in the message I talked about an oft-quoted theme here, and that is that God is always trying to take us someplace else, and that His journey never ends. And what happens to us is that we say, I'm good with where I am. I'm okay right here. Or we, as I said in the message, we settle for a little bit of God. I'll take just a little of God, but not the full dose of God, if that can even actually really happen where you can, because God certainly isn't pleased with that. But what we do is we just kind of become content with where we are. And as long as our world is relatively, I'm talking about our personal lives, are relatively stable, we don't travel any further with God. We just say, I'm going to camp right here. If that makes sense.
It does. Well, maybe people are watching and they're saying, that's me. That's exactly me. Or maybe people are watching and going, that could be me and I don't even know it.
Yeah.
How do you determine that for you, and how do you realize that I didn't know it, but I'm in captivity, and how do I go forward?
Yeah, and that's a good way to state it, Lance, is I think for For a lot of Christians, they're there, but they don't even realize it. And that's why I say it's not a malicious thing. It's not shaking the fist at God and saying, God, I refuse to go on. In fact, a lot of folks probably think I am traveling on just by kind of existing as a believer where I am. And so it is hard. I believe that the devil loves to keep us blinded to the fact that God has so much more for us. I used in my message the illustration, something my mentor said to me years ago. Remember, you can't steal second base if your foot is still on first. And that's the whole aspect of faith. So how do we find out? Am I still on first and God's trying to call me to second base, if you'll allow me to use that analogy? I think we have to ask God, God, where am I? God, would you reveal to me where I am? And I know that maybe sounds like an oversimplification, but I really think it starts there. And one of the ways you're going to find out where you are is by being faithful in the Word of God, to spend time with Him. And that's personal time. Lord, speak to me. And Lord, would you show me if there are new things that you want to do in my life? Would you reveal that to me? And mostly, I think, Lance, that happens from our personal devotional life, when we are honest with God and we say, where am I? Just ask Him. Ask Him, God, where am I? Not where somebody else. We're pretty good at figuring out where somebody else is, you know. But sometimes we just need to say, God, am I missing anything? And if I am, God, show me what I'm missing so that I can desire to go forward with you. I said in the message that that the place where we are is sometimes the place that God is using to discipline us. It is sometimes the place where God is using to create devotion in our life. And it is sometimes a place of desperation. I believe all three of those were true in our particular passage, but it can be true in our life, and that God has to create a sense of desperation sometimes to get us to say, okay, God, where I am is not where I want to stay, because you got more for us. But I just really think it begins by asking Him simply, God, where am I? Sincerely, where am I? And Lord, if I'm not where I need to be, or if I'm not traveling at all, Lord, show me how to take the first step, not all of the steps, but the first step. How do I step into some light and then let Him show me more and then take more steps? So I really think it begins right there. Lord, where am I? Speak to me from your word. And He will, because He wants you to know where you are, and He wants you to know how He wants you to take the next steps forward.
That's a good word, Pastor. Thank you. So if you think you may be in spiritual captivity when you've already been freed, just do what Pastor Ray said. Ask God to reveal that to you. God will be faithful. He will. And it may just be a baby step, one baby step at a time, and that will allow you to move forward. But it starts right there.